Hi everyone, and welcome to our last webinar in the winter series. I would like to introduce Claire Carroll. She's a PhD student working with Cambridge Digital Humanities in the Faculty of English. Her research focuses on the aesthetics of interactive fiction and how they might connect to broader digital behaviors. At Cambridge, she co-organizes the Cultural Politics of Code, a critical code studies reading group, and works on digital theatre hackathons. She's currently co-editing a special issue of AI in Society and Critical Code Studies. Claire is the recipient of the Judith Wilson Studentship affiliated with Pembroke College and was a 2023 and 24 CDH Methods Fellow. She's the 2025 Advocacy Fellow for the UK Ireland Digital Humanities Association. She holds a BA from Yale University in English and Computer Science and an MFA in Creative Writing at the University of St. Andrews. Very welcome to the webinar.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Um, I'm going to be talking a little bit today about engagement and surveillance in interactive sort of digital narratives. My main research in my dissertation focuses on interactive fiction, so I'll start with that, give a bit of a rundown, and bring us up a little bit more to the present day. Um, let's see if that'll work. So I'm going to start with something that feels completely different, which is a recent lawsuit based in one of the Disney amusement parks. There was a wrongful death suit following an allergy sort of based meal in one of the restaurants in the parks. And following that event, a man, Jeffrey Piccolo, filed a lawsuit, said you were negligent, and was told that he could not actually sort of engage in any litigation because he had signed up for a free trial of Disney Plus several years prior. And part of the terms and conditions of that stated that he agreed to go into arbitration instead of criminal proceedings in any dispute with Disney as a company. Subsequently, Disney sort of dropped this due to sort of righteous outrage. But that doesn't mean that this is sort of over. So another instance with Uber, who has the same practice in their terms and conditions, said that a couple was in an accident and their daughter had ordered something on Uber Eats. And part of the terms and conditions said arbitration had to be the way, so they were unable to sort of engage in any sort of court dispute with Uber as a company. And I know this seems really far away from any sort of literary engagement, but hopefully over the course of this talk, I'll be able to sort of explain how these things are really linked from earlier interactive texts to these court cases. Um, I'm going to start by talking about interactive fiction, which is sort of my main wheelhouse and area of research. And this term means different things to different people. And so we'll spend a little bit of time doing definitions. Historically, you can have a lot of sort of non-linear and interactive texts that are physical. So we have books like Hopscotch, which is a novel that can be read linearly or bouncing back and forth between different chapters. We have games like Dungeons and Dragons, which a lot of people consider types of interactive fiction, and other sort of stories that are playing with linear narratives, Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus, which is academic theory that can be read in theory in any order with the chapters. So this is a long-standing tradition in literary forms that has sort of been picked up in the digital, which makes it a lot easier as opposed to print publishing. We have the Choose Your Own Adventure, which is a parallel sort of development with interactive fiction in a lot of ways, which I'll talk about. But the long story short is Edward Packard was getting a divorce and he wanted to connect with his daughters. And so he came up with these games that he would play with them that were sort of, oh, we're telling a story. Which way do you want to go? And he would adjust the story. And he went to Ray Montgomery, who was a publisher, and they started publishing these texts to a fair degree of success. And sort of now it is the Empire, which he doesn't write them so much, but it is a large brand and based on sort of the choose your own style where you can turn to a page do something, turn to another page, do something. They didn't come up with this structure, but they're the ones that have popularized it and trademarked it, sort of notably. Um, they're still popular. Author Leslie Jameson wrote a sort of large profile in The New Yorker about sort of how they work and why they're compelling. And so for her, I think this is interesting to sort of look at in a bit more detail. The unnamed you narrator gives you an alternative to yourself or 40, right? The idea is that reading these texts gives you a chance to make mistakes or try something new or explore or experiment without actually harming your core self. Um, so they don't have to go together. You can do it as many times as you want. But it is sort of giving you a personal lens. This is something that academics have found holds true with modern choose your own adventure based like mobile games. So a really wonderful work by Lee Hall looks at Delight Games, which is a mobile based sort of choose your own adventure text adventure platform, does mobile narratives that surveys their user base. And by and large, the users said, we used to hate reading. This was never a thing that was interesting to us. And now we love it. And we read all the time. And this is a really great way for us to engage. But almost more than that, they said that they learned a lot about themselves. A lot of readers described it almost like therapy, where they learned how they made decisions and why they made decisions. So making these choices is really helping, in this case, the players engage with versions of themselves or themselves as an individual, which we'll come back to a little bit later. Um, in terms of actual definitions of what we'll be looking at, um, electronic literature is not physical texts that have been brought online. It is texts that are made for a digital environment. And this has a lot of overlap with computer games. And I'll be talking about some computer games. It's not a very clear distinction, but a lot of scholars divide it based on whether the gameplay and the puzzles are the point or the narrative is the point, which can often depend on how the readers perceive it. Jeremy Douglas describes them as text adventure games and defines it basically by mechanic only. So says it has to be the command line which is used. Michael Joyce does a lot of hypertext interactive fiction, so says it's just a story that changes every time you read it. It doesn't actually have to do anything with choice. And Graham Nelson has a very funny definition, at least originally, where he said it was a crossword at war with a narrative, which I think is kind of a fun way of thinking about it. Again, bringing us back to the beginning, adventure is interactive fiction widely considered the first digital interactive fiction by Will Crowther, who was, again, getting a divorce, wanted to connect with his daughters. I don't know why this kept happening in the 70s, but that's how it goes. And he liked to explore caves, so made a game about caves. And this was sort of widely distributed through specialist developers, picked up by Don Woods, who added a lot of fantasy elements, and it sort of became successful among a niche technical audience. It was frustrating. It didn't have a very large vocabulary due to memory constraints, but this was something where you type in commands very explicitly, and then things happen. So readers or players get to have a direct impact on the world. This was mimicked quite successfully by a group at MIT who created Zork, which is considered sort of the first widely commercially successful video game. It was distributed by Infocom, and they made several sequels. It sort of kickstarted this genre as a commercial one. And had a lot of the similar problems in terms of vocabulary and memory size, but kept a lot of the same themes. So very fantasy based, very physical exploration rooted as a mechanic, and something that the reader or player would type in commands and move through the map or execute things. I'm going to take a pause from talking about those to go into the different ways that we think about interaction here, because this definition is, I think, also a relevant one. Um, Hartmut Kuntz describes sort of two types of interactivity with interactive narratives. So he says that we have the level of interaction you get from reading. So just I am reading a text and then I am creating a world in my mind based on what I'm reading. So if I say there's a red cat in my head, I am in some way imagining a red cat, whether I picture that or just sort of now have placed that in an imagined state. That's happening. Interactivity two is the level of making choices and executing on them. And so that's where we start to get the gameplay element brought in. These things overlap a lot of the times, and a lot of the times the things that we think are interactivity two might just be interactivity one, which is where we get into a little bit of tricky things with agency. Um, Hence interactive digital narratives. Um, these I've put a few different definitions uh, up here just in case you want to look at them. But essentially, they say it's a form of narrative that changes based on input from an audience. So the audience or player or reader, depending on what word you're using, has to have some input in order for the narrative to proceed. Um, Janet Murray ties this a lot with dramatic agency. So she says that it is the satisfying power to take meaningful action and see the results of decisions and choices. Um, so sort of, oh, you can tell that you are influencing the story directly. This doesn't always happen, which is why I think the distinction between interactivity one and two really matters because you can't always tell. Uncle Roger by Judy Malloy is sort of one of the first hypertext fictions, if not the first. There's a little bit of dispute on that. And there's a lot of options to click on different words or keywords and to move forward the story. But it is entirely sort of unclear whether the fact that you clicked that word meant that it was tied to that or that there was just the next chunk in a sort of linear progression of the story is what's been preloaded. You can't necessarily tell the impact that you've had. It's not clear. This also happens in Afternoon a Story by Michael Joyce, where which is a text about a father who thinks his son might have been killed in a car accident. Um, it is a looping story, so there's never actually a finish point. Joyce recently did a sort of complete read through for an anniversary, 25, and found that he sort of got an hour in and then said, I'm done now, I'm going to stop because the text never ends. And it is entirely unclear, again, whether you're clicking something that leads directly via a hot word or a keyword to a choice-based new set of words, or whether it is just the next thing. So I think the divide between interactivity one and two and how agency factors into that is something that is already at stake with these text-based games. A sort of newer version that was very popular with my friends in the past sort of year is What Vegetable Are You by Sophie Liu, which is a project just on GitHub, sort of a fun text-based game with some cute animation. And you go through questions, you choose options, you say, oh, do I scream for help or do I cry or do I ask existentially if I'm going to die? And you go through little choices. And then at the end, you are told, here's the vegetable that you are. It doesn't have any correlation, as far as I can tell, to anything that you do. The alignments and hidden talents don't seem sort of tied to any of the choices that you make. But that doesn't matter because it's still a fun game and everyone wanted to know whether they were a potato or a carrot. So a lot of the times the level one of interactivity is enough to make it feel like you have some agency or interactivity too, even if that's not necessarily tied. Um, this has sort of, it's not a direct correlation, but there's been some wonderful work by Anna Resk and Mads Haar, who are sort of pulling apart different ways of using agency in interactive digital narratives. So they sort of are looking more at theatrical performances and sort of television-based projects. And they have divided it up to sort of say you have obscured agency, which is you can only tell after you do something many, many times, sort of whether you've had an impact or not. And you can see narrative change as a result of different forking paths. So it's not, oh, I know that I've done something. It's, I have no idea that I've done anything until I do it several times. Invisible agency is instead something where you don't know the choices that you're making and the impact that they have, but the system is using the choices you're making as variables and going through to adjust different endings. So it's not necessarily ever an observable thing. You can't say, I made this one choice and then this thing happened and I can see that very clearly. It's, oh, a lot of factors are all filtering in to give a different impact. And this is sort of more of a black box approach. So it's harder to tell what you're getting out of it. There's also involuntary agency, which is a bit more rare, but is still something that they discuss, which is where you use biosensors to track physical audience responses like heart rate and adjust pathways accordingly. So this is something where audiences know the impact that they're having on a story. They can tell, oh, I can see my heart rate's gone up. That's impacting something, but it's not something that they can control, which often increases anxiety and is used really successfully in horror genres. Um, yes. So that's sort of the three different tiers, which again, we'll kind of keep looking at. I don't know if there's any way for people to ask questions, but if you have questions, hang on to them for now. Um, Jumping into free will, head first. Little old me. Um, there's a wonderful game called The Stanley Parable. It came out in 2013. Um, which I don't know if any of you guys have played it, but it's very similar to some very popular television right now on Apple TV, where you play someone named Stanley who is working in an office pressing buttons. And one day you turn up to work and no one else is in the office and nobody tells you, you get no commands to say, press this button. And you sort of, there's text-based narration. So while the game is physically navigated, you navigate an office as a physical avatar, which you can't see, but the narration gives you instructions throughout. So you say, oh, go through the left door, not the right door. And if you go through the right door, it says, why have you gone the wrong way around? You've done all of this sort of wrong. And it comes out that you are part of a large panopticon mind control facility that has been influencing your emotions to make you very docile and press buttons for a very long time. There are several different endings that you can achieve, and this is a game that's rooted in sort of the obscured agency of playing things over and over and over again. But also the agency isn't just invisible or obscured, it's sort of rejected in a lot of the game versions. So for instance, while initially you mostly just click, at a certain point you start becoming you, the player, the Stanley that is told to press buttons. So it says press P, press F to continue the narrative. And this one sort of says press Z to watch TV, whether or not you want to, that's sort of what you do. And if you press Z, the TV disappears. So at certain points, you are punished for playing along. And the narration discusses to great detail sort of the illusion of free will and the control that the system you're a part of is propagating. But I want to link this, and this is the part where we get a little bit of stretch. So if you have any questions about it or problems with it, I'd love to hear what you think. The illusion of free will that that game talks about gets picked up, I think, a lot in contemporary narratives, which we'll look at Arcade very briefly, and Bandersnatch is the main case study for this, that picks up a nostalgic aesthetic that is rooted in a bit more ideas of free will and the Wild West frontier of the early internet to try and assume that we have free will in these spaces, even while the control is sort of being narrowed in and narrowed in. So Arcade is an immersive theatrical project done by Darkfield. This past year, they sort of do immersive projects in shipping containers and they tour them around to different cities around the world. I saw it when it was in Scotland. And this project sort of says, using nostalgic 8-bit aesthetic of 1980s video games, this interactive narrative explores evolving relationships between players and avatars. And you go in and you put on headphones. So again, it's sort of text-based in an audio way, narrative in that way. And all the lights go out and you have one button. And all you can do is sort of say yes or no by pressing the button or not pressing the button. So you don't ultimately get the aesthetic that I think the graphics around it, so the image here on the left, show you of this neon bright nostalgic gaze. They're just sort of imagining that that is happening and then using that to put you into their story. And the story is sort of received entirely in the dark. So you don't have any of that 8-bit aesthetic ever as part of the story. But they do sort of lean to that and the choose your own adventure idea to make you feel like, oh, this is a video game with a capital V, and that's cool. This is not just me saying this. The sort of nostalgia of early internet as a more free space, and as a romantic space, explicitly, is something that artists are looking at. I know I was very sad when Flash went away a few years ago, and we lost a lot of the early sort of very simple 8-bit games. But this is a tool now to go back to that nostalgia. And there's some really cool, if anyone's interested in sort of more social media analytics, there are some good explorations of Facebook groups specifically targeting nostalgia and how those are working. But that's a little bit outside of the scope of this. So all of that is to say, Bandersnatch is really interesting and is something that I think is worth exploring in the history of interactive fiction and sort of with that lineage. So it was a project that came out in 2018. I don't know if any of you guys played it or saw it. That was a part of the Black Mirror series, which was a traditional sci-fi series on television. So just you sit and watch it. You don't have any interaction. But this was sort of the big premiere of Netflix's interactive content angle. So you would go and you would make choices. The first choice in this one is which cereal you want to eat for breakfast, Sugar Puffs or Frosties. And at this point, it's sort of early on, the Stefan, our main character, is reading a choose your own adventure book called Bandersnatch. He's very excited about it. And his dad says, okay, well, you can choose your own adventure. Which cereal do you want? And the choice is a very benign one, right? It seems like it doesn't matter. And sort of through obscured agency and repeat plays, viewers found that later there would be an ad on the TV. And depending on which one you chose, the ad would either be for Frosties if you chose Frosties or Sugar Puffs if you chose Sugar Puffs. So a very simple choice that didn't really impact the whole narrative, but was present nonetheless. Obviously, these choices get more complicated as the story progresses. So we have Stefan is making a text game. So he is trying to make a text adventure game like Zork and like Colossal Cave Adventure as part of this narrative, leaning into that nostalgia pretty heavily. But in this case, you don't have to type in the commands. You just get to choose using a joystick. So you don't have to have a keyboard. Everyone's very excited. They make a sort of direct Zork reference, which is fun. But he gets really frustrated at the job. So you have the option, you can throw T or destroy the computer. And they sort of increase in violence going from there. I won't go too much into the specific choice examples, but this is sort of as it starts to go up. And there are 10 or so endings that you can get depending on which choices that you make. This is a part of the landscape that we've already been looking at. So the Choose Your Own Adventure company, ChooseCo, sued Netflix for the use of Choose Your Own Adventure as a trademark, since Stefan directly references the books, says he's playing one, and a lot of the branding for the show was about it's a Choose Your Own Adventure thing, which if we go back to the arcade thing really briefly, you can see they're really careful not to say choose your own adventure. They say choose your own unique journey, choose your own path experience, but they're never going to say choose your own adventure, even though they're also very much trying to pick up on this language, but they learned from the lawsuit. Uh, so this is something where apparently Netflix was talking to Juice Code to try and get the rights for a long time, and then just stopped and made it anyway. And they did settle that out of court for an undisclosed sum. But yes, so this is very much a part of that landscape and a part of this narrative history. Um, but the difference here is that we're not getting the same multiplicity and we're not getting the same alternatives that the physical texts had. So the distinction that we get between the original text-based games, which while early on with Infocom, you had to pay, you bought these games like everything else. Now, sort of interactive fictions are largely free to play. You can play Zork online, no problem. The interactive fictions that are being created today are pretty much all free. Sometimes you can pay to get an illustrated version, but the text-based ones, entirely sort of up for grabs. Here you can download them, so you don't actually have any tracking. It's all sort of done offline if you want to, or you can play them online. But it's very much an individual experience that you can keep replaying. And you do get these alternatives to yourself or 4D. It does include the distortion, recklessness, and multiplicity. However, what Netflix is kind of doing with this project is they're taking that language and that assumption that you get from the Choose Your Own Adventure, and they are co-opting it for data extraction. So Michael Veal, who is a law professor at UCL, said, "Oh, I really wonder what data Netflix got out of me playing Bandersnatch." And to my knowledge, he still hasn't published a paper on this. He sort of just did a big Twitter thread, so I hope you'll forgive the social media use here. But it's a really interesting sort of exploration. So he sent in his GDPR request and he said, okay, I want to know what you took out of this. And sort of they sent back a very good key to say, oh, each choice is labeled and we know when you made the choice, how you made the choice, and whether you made the choice by abstaining or not. So in this, you have 10 seconds. If you don't make a choice, it just picks one kind of at random. So they know if you did that as well. And he asked them sort of how this was going. And they said, oh, we keep the information for an undisclosed amount of time. He didn't ask how long. And he said that while we maintain the personal data for each player, we do not use it at an individual level. Everything is done in aggregate. So they use, again, the serial example here. But at the bottom, you sort of can say, oh, with all of the titles on our service, we track at an aggregated level the interactions with the title, such as total number of views, to help us perform a range of business analysis operations. We do the same thing for choices made as part of a branching narrative, again, at an aggregated level. For example, to help us determine how to improve the model of storytelling in the context of a show or a movie. So this is something where they say, we care about how much you watch. We don't care about you as an individual person. Which is sort of what they generally say in terms of their engagement reports. So these are the things that they release to consumers, and they say, oh, this is how many hours this was viewed. Is it available globally? This is how many people viewed it. And they're not getting more specific than that. So this seems like, oh, that's okay. Everyone still loves Avatar: The Last Airbender. That's great. But we're not getting more specific than that. However, this is just not necessarily true. And while Michael Veal seemed very convinced with the information they got from Netflix that they were not doing anything sort of specifically malicious with this data, they did get slightly more specific. And yes, this is only slightly, but they started very coyly via social media saying, oh, 60% of his friends picked Frosties. Okay. And then Netflix UK and Ireland said, compared to the rest of the world, Brits were less likely to waste a good cup of tea. So throw tea was chosen only 52.9% of the time, and the rest of the world was 55.9% of the time. So this is, while not, again, at the individual level, still something that we're getting more specific and more specific with the way that this data is being used. And we're capitalizing on the nostalgia of the choose your own adventure structure and interactive fiction, since that's what this whole project was about. in order to sort of mask a little bit the way that this agency is playing out and the way that it's being interpreted. Um, this is, again, slightly more of a stretch, but these things feed into the way that Spotify works. And the work that I'm sort of engaging in right now is connecting the very literal narratives that we engage with, something like Bandersnatch, with the other digital behaviors that we use and the way that we develop personalities through them and develop characters for ourselves in digital spaces through them. So when Spotify did sort of their billboard ads, and they continued to do these, so the first one's in 2016. Dear person who played Sorry 42 times on Valentine's Day, what did you do? I figure this would be romance themed since that's next week. They did it again in 2018. They said, be as loving as the person who put 48 Ed Sheeran songs on their I Love Gingers playlist. Shape of You, the most streamed song ever. Partially, they're moving this towards advertising. So, right, this is definitely a plug for Ed Sheeran, but is also them saying, oh, we only do aggregate data for all of our streaming, but also we're very specific when we want to be. And this is something that we will sell to advertisers and that you will develop a personal identity around. So we have the sort of Spotify Wrapped trend, which has been going on for about 5 years now, where they say, oh, you've listened to X amount of this artist. Here the percentage compared to other people. And while they've recently been gutting that team, so it's been a lot more AI produced and seemingly based on sort of feedback a little bit less successful. It is still very much saying your listening habits can tell us something about who you are as a person and the way that you're engaging digitally, which is, of course, what they want to sell to advertisers. So they have different categories that they have sort of named, created, marketed to ad companies to say obsession is a category that you can have that we know about based on how often you listen to the same song over and over and over again. And that makes you compulsive, and that means that you're very likely to just purchase something if that's the way that the advertisers sort of receive that. Nostalgia is, oh, you listen to a lot of things from middle school, or you go to a lot of 90s things over and over again. You're looking backwards. That's something that's really interested to you, as opposed to tastemakers when you're trying to find new music all the time. So they take these things that are seemingly just about music, but they develop into these personas called streaming intelligence, which look at psychographic and behavioral insights to try and get way more specific, at least claim that they're way more specific for advertisers. This lines up pretty well with the way that users are engaging with these things. And this is sort of why I think about a lot of things like music streaming as part of a broader interactive digital narrative that we're building about ourselves. There was a case in December where a candidate for New Jersey governor faked his Spotify Wrapped and said, oh, here are my top songs. It's all Bruce Springsteen. I love Bruce Springsteen. And a lot of people came on and said, oh, the fonts are all wrong. The pictures are the wrong size. You faked this. And he came out and didn't really apologize. He just said, oh, well, this is what it would be if I didn't share my account with my 12 and 15-year-old kids. So this is the identity that I see for myself and the identity that I would like to have created digitally, because we can only create one identity digitally and we're not responsible for how those decisions are being made. That's up to Spotify. That's up to Netflix. So this is how he's trying to make up for it, by pretending. And some people thought this was funny, and some people thought that this was really a breach of trust. So in this way, we can see that while users may still want to have the multiplicity of identity that came along with a lot of the earlier choose your own adventures and text-based games, interactive digital narratives now are a lot more control-based and a lot more about obscured and involuntary agency. And in this way, involuntary doesn't just mean heart rate, it means decisions that we don't realize necessarily are decision points. I want to pan out just a little bit more. I know I've stretched pretty far from texts, to see how this can be used slightly more maliciously and more at surveillance on a more traditional metric. So this was a project done by Riley Waltz, who's a developer in San Francisco, last year, which was sort of making critiquing ShotSpotter, which is our microphones that are used by American police to try and hear gunshots, to try and improve the places that they're patrolling, which have been found widely ineffective and largely sort of used to bolster discriminatory practices. Um, so in this case, Waltz put a box on a pole in San Francisco and put a phone on Shazam with a solar-powered battery and a mic to just listen to music as people were listening to it via boomboxes or in their cars or out loud on their phones. And he described it as culture surveillance. No one notices, no one consents. But it's not about catching criminals, it's about catching vibes. A constant feed about what's popping off in real time. This project did die. I think it just fell off the pole, as far as I can tell, in November, but was up for a while and would just keep streaming different things that were coming out. So this was sort of a very kind of fun way of doing it. But again, looking at the 8-bit nostalgia, looking at how we are being surveilled through our choices, maybe involuntarily, and what that can say. In this case, it's about a city rather than an individual person. Um, I love captchas. I think they're really interesting. And again, gets at the question about what is choice and what is agency in digital spaces. I don't think anyone would say that checking I'm not a robot is part of a narrative of their experience necessarily. If you would, please talk to me. I would love to interview you. But in this case, right, this is a part of the way that we have to engage with digital anything. You want to buy something, you want to make an email account, you want to engage in any way with digital experiences. I earlier today was looking up some information about some games, and it sort of automatically came up before I even got to the website. Oh, you have to do a CAPTCHA so that you can get in. These don't necessarily feel like choices since there is a right or a wrong answer, but it is something like Stanley Parable where we click the buttons that we're supposed to click in order to proceed forward. It feels very benign. It feels very disjointed from the other sort of narratives of our day and our lives. However, all of the captchas are being used to train AI models, which is really sort of roundabout since we're saying captchas are supposed to prove that you're human against an AI model, but then they're used to train future AI models. And yesterday, Google said that they would no longer not use AI for weapons and traditional forms of surveillance. So they had initially said, we don't want to use AI in ways that cause harm. And now they've said they're not worried about that anymore. In their own sort of internal report, they said that we believe democracies should lead in AI development, guided by core values like freedom, equality, and respect for human rights. Sorry, I'll fix my tone. And we believe that companies, governments, and organizations sharing these values should work together to create AI that protects people, promotes global growth, and supports national security. If national security is ShotSpotter, what does that mean? If increased surveillance is national security, what does that mean? So I think all of these things are unfortunately really tied up together. And the boundaries between traditional narratives and traditional games, while they are there and offer us interesting examples as texts exploring free will, agency, interactivity, choice, they are all feeding into the ways that we behave more broadly online. And those behaviors have very strong real world implications. So getting back to sort of the original court case where we had the Disney Plus terms and conditions, and the idea that interactive texts are designed to make people more comfortable with reading and more able to read in ways that they might not traditionally be okay with engaging with. Terms and conditions are largely made to be unreadable, and yet it is expected that we have read them, even though it's kind of expected that we haven't read them. So it is a choice that is not a choice. And while it is sort of easy to laugh about the Disney case now, I think this tweet is pretty funny. The joy of watching Bob's Burgers on Disney Plus is slightly diminished, knowing Mickey is legally allowed to hunt me for sport because I signed up for the streaming service. That was done on the day that they dropped that case, so that was a joke entirely. It is still something that all of these choices and all of these narratives are kind of folded in on each other. And yeah, thank you very much. That's that for me.
Thank you very much, Claire, for this fascinating and inspiring talk and topic on interactive digital narratives and the surveillance involved in it. Thank you.